How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another Halloween episode. Today I'll show you how to turn your sourdough bread into a pumpkin. Look at that beautiful blistery crust. We achieved this by a long cold proof. And to make it taste like a pumpkin, we'll use pumpkin puree instead of water in the main dough. So let's get right to it and see what we need to make this. A cast iron pan with a lid is your best friend. If you don't have one, you can bake this on a tray. You'll also need a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, temperature probe, a brush, some butcher's string, and a clean cloth or tea towel for proofing. Now on to the ingredients. We'll need some strong white bread flour, salt, water, an egg for brushing, a nice and active sourdough starter. I feed this guy once a day and it has a hydration of 80%. We'll also need a cinnamon stick for the stem of the pumpkin. This will make it look nice and realistic. And last but not least, we will need a pumpkin and a tray to roast it in. But you want to dice it up before you roast it. That's better. Cover your tray with some tin foil so your pumpkin doesn't dry out. Make sure your oven is preheated to 190 degrees Celsius, fan off, which is 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Now roast it for around 1 hour. I know it seems like a long time, but it may take even longer. You want it to be completely soft and mushy. Squishing it with a fork should be effortless. Now we only need 250 grams or 8.8 ounces of cooked pumpkin, so you should start off with at least 300 grams or 10.5 ounces. Now mash the pumpkin up, cover it and stick it in the fridge to cool down completely. We can move on to making our leaven. We'll be pre-fermenting around 20% of the total flour. Since I keep my starter at a hydration of 80%, I'm going to make my leaven at the same hydration. This makes it more predictable because I already know how my starter reacts. I used to keep my starter at 100% hydration. After a while, I found that lowering the hydration makes it more manageable. It's not as active, it rises more slowly, and it's more forgiving. Quick note on the water, I'm using filtered water for my starter and for the leaven, and for the bread. My starter really doesn't like tap water, so if you're having troubles with your starter being nice and active, perhaps it is the water. Right, let's move on. I mix my water, starter and the flour until there's no more dry flour left. I'm going to leave them to ferment for 12 to 16 hours. The leaven should almost triple in volume, and this is puffed up beautifully. I actually left it for around 14 hours. You can see where it's starting to fall back in on itself. That means it's ready. But if you're not ready to make your bread yet, you can stick this in the fridge for up to 12 hours and use it later, but you will have to adjust the pumpkin temperature to compensate. I'm using my leaven at room temperature, so I want my pumpkin to be cold from the fridge. But regardless of what you do, take a large bowl, add the pumpkin and the salt. Now give it all a good mix. You want to dissolve the salt real quick. Next up, add the leaven, and it should be nice and strong. If you can pour it out the bowl, it's over fermented. You might as well start over. But this looks beautiful. It's full of fermentation gases. And it is nice and stretchy. It keeps in one piece. I wonder if you could make a leaven with pumpkin puree. So not use any water in the recipe, just use pumpkin. It would probably work. I might try it sometime. Anyhow, after the leaven, add the flour and mix everything together until there's no more dry flour left. Now pop your dough out on the table and knead it. This is not sticky at all, so I'm going to use a regular kneading method. What I like to do is press down and forwards with the heel of my right hand, then using the fingers on my left hand I fold the piece of dough under the heel of my right hand. Now I turn it and repeat. And around 8 minutes later, the dough should be ready. This has a hydration of about 67%, so it's a little bit sticky, but easy to manage. Let's pop this baby in the bowl and take its temperature. Around 24 to 25 degrees Celsius is just about right for this. We want a nice slow proof. Now cover it up and give it 2.5 to 3 hours. You want it to be visibly puffed up before you take the next step. As you can see, this dough is puffing up quite well, and we'll give it one fold halfway through bulk fermentation. It'll help us with degassing the dough and giving it extra strength. That'll make our pumpkin have a nice shape. So dust your dough ball lightly with flour, release it from the bowl using a dough scraper, then pop it out on the table, smooth side down. Now gently flatten it out, and then fold an edge over the middle, going around in a circle until it reaches the point where you started. You have a nice tight ball. You can see how we are creating extra layers in the dough. And once you feel it becoming tighter, flip it smooth side up again and finish it by tightening it against the table. Now we can pop it back into the bowl, still smooth side pointing up, cover it up and leave it to proof for another 2.5 to 3 hours. And now it should really start puffing up. And if your dough is fermenting rapidly, cut the fermentation time down. If it needs longer, leave it for longer. But this one looks just about right to me. Now we can do the final shaping. And it's performed exactly the same way as the fold. Dust your dough with flour, release it from the bowl, pop it out on the table, smooth side pointing down, flatten it out, then fold the edge over the middle, going around in a circle to reach point where you started. Then flip it smooth side up again, finish tightening it against the table, and that's your shaping done. And you may think, isn't the final shaping when we turn it into a pumpkin? No, because this is the last opportunity we get to make the dough nice and strong. You could call the pumpkin part scoring. And if you don't know what I'm on about, you need to check out the Steps of Baking playlist. Right, after shaping, line your bowl with a cloth. You do not need any flour, this dough will not stick. Place it in a bowl, smooth side pointing down. Pinch the seam together, now cover it up, and I'm using cling film, not my glass lid, because the lid leaves a gap, and we don't want this to dry out whilst it's in the fridge for up to 24 hours. 1 hour before baking, preheat your oven and your pan, 220 degrees Celsius, fan off. If you don't have a pan like this, preheat a thick bottom tray. Right, let's look at this dough. I cold proofed it for around 18 hours. And just look at that, it's puffed up beautifully. It's huge. And now it's ready to become a pumpkin. Now take a piece of parchment paper and organize your butcher's string. Make a cross first and then lay the rest down with even gaps. This may seem simple, but this is my second time making this. The first one was a disaster, so pay attention. Now place your loaf on the string with the smooth side pointing up. And now brush with the egg all over. If you don't want to use egg, you can use milk instead. Or perhaps a vegan alternative. So to avoid messing this up, every time you pick up a string, move it back and forth to make sure you're holding onto the same piece. It may sound silly, but trust me, it's better to be safe than sorry. Tie the string quite close to the loaf. A good way to gauge it is sticking a finger between the loaf and the string. There should be just enough space for one finger. And do a double knot, nice and tight, so nothing opens up. Lastly, trim off all the loose ends. If you don't, they will leave marks on the bread. You don't want that. Next up, the stem of the pumpkin. Take a cinnamon stick and jam it right into the loaf, right down to the table. Don't be shy here, really go for it. And lastly, you can just organize the strings so you have nice even gaps between them. But you know, pumpkins are not perfect by nature, so your loaf doesn't have to be. I'd rather it look like a real pumpkin than a plastic one. Now take your preheated pan out of the oven, remove the lid, add the bread, put the lid back on and stick it in the oven for 20 minutes. If you don't have a lid, simply put it in the oven and bake it for 35 minutes. But if you do have a lid, after 20 minutes, remove the pan, remove the lid, and stick the pumpkin back in the oven for another 20 minutes of baking. It should have a nice, rich and golden brown color. And just look at that beauty. And look at those blisters on the crust. I think they really add to the pumpkin effect. And we got those blisters thanks to the slow cold proof. And the moisture in the egg wash also helped with it. That cinnamon stick made my house smell amazing whilst the bread was baking. I left the loaf to cool down before removing the strings, just makes it easier. But there you have it, that's how you make a sourdough pumpkin loaf. What do you think of this recipe? Have you tried making something like this before? I think this is a perfect Halloween or Thanksgiving project. It's beautiful, you can use it as decoration, and you can also eat it. What's not to love? And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions, let me know down in comments. And check out the sourdough bread playlist, where I have plenty more videos. And if you're having troubles with your starter, check out the sourdough starter playlist. Because on this channel, we don't only look at recipes, we also look at bread baking principles, which as you know, are far more valuable than recipes alone. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because if you love bread and baking, you definitely come to the right place. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.